This research story starts with me discussing with my sister her little road trip to Colorado this summer that she is taking with her boyfriend. My family and I were discussing it, and I don't know who brought it up. I think it was me. Her boyfriend is black, so I think I asked, "You're not going through, any scary towns, are you? Any sundown towns?" Although I do think that he's significantly safer with her in the car, I worry sometimes. They're going from Illinois to Colorado, so it was Iowa and Nebraska that made me raise an eyebrow there. This launched me into my first minor research into sundown towns, present and past. As soon as I asked this question to her and she said she didn't know, of course, I do a little Googling. And I am immediately affronted by this graphic. Yeah, no, seeing this map was not what I expected to see. I'm sorry, look at the fucking dot over Indiana and Illinois. Like, you might as well just put one huge red circle over the 3 states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. I was flabbergasted, concerned. I had a Northern American brain moment where I didn't seem to realize that sundown towns primarily existed in the Midwest in comparison to the rest of the country. In hindsight, that was a stupid North good, South bad bias that I shouldn't have had. And today we're going to shake up your North good, South bad bias, because sundown towns are not primarily in the South. And in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense given, history. I immediately started to do some research. I read Sundown Towns by James Loewen, which is just a chunk of a book. It is like 500 pages of research. It was published in 2006, so some of the data is a little bit outdated. I would like some, updated data. I will be frequently quoting Sundown Towns by James Loewen throughout this video. He defines a sundown town as any organized jurisdiction that for decades kept African Americans or other groups from living in it, and thus all white on purpose. He goes on to explain that all white is in quotation marks because he believes that even if you have 5 African American folks living in your town, you still can be a sundown town because, why are only 5 African Americans living amongst 17,000 white people? It's a little suspicious. In fact, James Loewen had the same surprise I did finding out about Illinois. I live in Illinois. I've been upfront about that. Hi. I was flabbergasted, just disgusted by the amount of historical and potentially present-day sundown towns there are in Illinois. And I will read a quote from James that sort of encapsulates, that surprise. In 1999, when I started serious research on these communities, I expected to find perhaps 10 in Illinois, my home state, and maybe 50 across the country. I had no idea how widespread the practice was. Neither did anyone else I talked with. Today, my estimate for the number of sundown towns in Illinois alone stands at 507. That is 2/3 of all the towns in the state. A similar proportion went sundown in Oregon, Indiana, and various other northern states. 507. 507 historical sundown towns. Are all of them remaining still sundown towns today? Not necessarily. That was a shock, a slap in the face with reality, I think. And in hindsight, once again, I really should have known better. Because I know that some small, especially Midwestern towns and, the rich suburbs are racist. I know that. I just didn't understand the prevalence of sundown towns until now. And once again, it, in hindsight, makes a lot of sense for a couple different reasons, especially after reading some history and putting the context together. A sundown town needs to be all white or without black people to be considered a sundown town. A majority of the black population in the United States historically and presently live in the South, which that is due to the history of slavery. And with that being said, creating a town that does not have black people in it, when a majority of the black population is, in the area, is much, much more difficult. So it makes sense that there's less sundown towns in the South than there are in the Midwest, because there are less black people in the Midwest. Additionally, because there were not black people up north often until, the black slaves were freed and until the Great Migration, white people up north were not used to seeing black people around them, or most other races, to be honest. While people down south were slave owners and were, used to being around black people for nefarious reasons, people up north were more likely to be exclusionary of black people because they were not, used to them being in their towns and being around them. So it makes sense that of a racist white population, the northern ones would be exclusionary. This is also coupled with the fact, and my last reason why this should have been obvious, white people up north, while they were exclusionary, white people down south were sort of flabbergasted that white people up north were exclusionary of black people in their towns, because white people down south were like, why would you do that when you can exploit them for their labor? So, this is, to make sure we all understand here, this video is not Midwest bad, South good. This is Midwest also bad. I need to get us on the same page here. The South was still racist. It was just, the white people down south were just racist in a different way than people in the Midwest were. People in the Midwest wanted nothing to do with black people. They wanted to exclude black people, wanted them out of their towns, while white people down south wanted to exploit black people for their labor, as they were already doing, but now they had to pay them to do it. Of course, it was less than they would pay a white person, and they still, enforced curfew on black people down south as well, but they did not exclude them from their towns as often as white people did in the Midwest. So in hindsight, altogether, given the history of slavery, it makes sense that there would be less sundown towns in the South, or the traditional South, than, in the Midwest. Indiana and Illinois are some of the worst states for sundown towns, specifically. I know Ohio is too. Illinois and Indiana just had whole sundown counties, not even towns, sundown counties. And like I said before, the traditional South, like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, is less likely to have sundown towns than like the less traditional South. Like, for instance, there is a smattering of sundown towns in, the Appalachia, the Ozarks, the Cumberlands, Florida, North and West Texas. So it's not like they weren't in the South. They just were less likely to be in the traditional South due to slavery. Now, I will say that some of the towns on the map that I'm going to link are recovering sundown towns, but they're noted because they're historically sundown towns. So there are, some towns that are no longer considered sundown towns. For instance, Oak Park is a suburb of Illinois, and it was created to be an all-white suburb. In fact, the first black family's home of Oak Park was firebombed on Thanksgiving in 1950. But now Oak Park has about, it is about 19% black people. So, that's not to say that a former sundown town is no longer racist, but if 19% of your population are black people, then it is no longer a sundown town. However, it is important to note that there are absolutely places in the Midwest that were historically and presently sundown towns. Particularly, the best example of this is Kenilworth, Illinois. The first African-American family to buy a home in Kenilworth had a cross burned on their lawn, although that did not deter them. Kenilworth is a very, very wealthy suburb of Chicago. In 2018, they were the 8th wealthiest town in the United States, and the wealthiest in the Midwestern United States. And as of the 2020 census, 0% of the population was black. So Kenilworth was a sundown town in the past, and it is now. And that's how you can really tell if it's still a sundown town. It is important to note that if a town in the United States, as of the year of 2023, if it still does not have black people, more than 1%, that is on purpose. That was not an accident. They purposefully do not have black people in their town. People will be like, oh, it's just normal that black people sort of band together and all went to one town. No, it's not. It wasn't normal. In fact, after the Great Migration came the Great Retreat, is what James Lowen writes in Sundown Towns. They were smattered across the Midwest, black people, but they had to retreat to certain towns that would accept them and create all black towns, because white people were pushing them out with hate crimes, ordinances, and signs that say, keep your black ass out of here after sundown. And by the way, that is the PG-13 way to say it, because they used slurs on those signs. In fact, to prove this point, I have a quote from James Lowen. I did more research in Illinois than any other single state. Table 1 shows that African Americans lived in every Illinois county in 1980. By 1930, 6 counties had none, while another 11 had fewer than 10 African American residents. Without a doubt, exclusion underlies these numbers. During the Great Migration, African Americans did spread out. They just were forced to retreat. It's not normal for there to be all white communities, especially with the, large population of black people that there are. And it especially should not be so in 2023. There are 40 million black people in the United States. If your town does not have one black person, not even one, that's purposeful. That there's no way that was on accident. And mind you, you could say, oh, it's because of the, class disparity in race, and that's why black people aren't in Kenilworth, Illinois. First and foremost, there are rich black people that could go to Kenilworth, Illinois if they wanted to. Second of all, James Lowen did find out that it was regardless of the town's median salary range. That was not a factor in whether a place is going to be a sundown town, although the suburbs and gated communities and HOAs were weaponized against black people and still are weaponized against black people. It didn't matter how rich or poor the town was. If it was a sundown, it was a sundown. There was, poor tiny little towns in the middle of Illinois, and then there was rich places like Kenilworth. The class didn't matter. There was racist motherfuckers in all tax brackets. I know a lot of people are thinking, well, it's not all of them are still sundown towns, or it's not as bad as it used to be. I don't know if it's not as bad as it used to be is a great way to describe that, because I suppose these towns don't have signs hanging around saying, don't have your black ass here after sundown, but still not great. The main form that they've used to keep black people out of their towns is policing, is using the local police force to keep black people out of town. Additionally, there are just racist people that do still verbally and physically harass black people that go into their towns, and that is considered sundown town behavior. If you immediately just want to intimidate a black person out of your town as soon as one of them enters, you're doing sundown town bullshit. And that is regardless if you have a stupid little sign that says the N-word on it. But here's another quote from Mr. Lowen to give you an idea about, and mind you, this data is from 2006, so there might be less sundown towns than he describes now than there was 17 years ago, but this is what it was like as of 2006. News from the Midwest is not so encouraging. I estimate that about half of Illinois' sundown towns have changed. To calculate this estimate, I examined the 2000 census data for 167 Illinois communities that I had confirmed as sundown towns as of mid-2004. Of these, 59, or almost 40%, were no longer all white, in quotation marks. To that total, I added a few towns that had no black households as of 2000, but have opened up since then, such as Steelville, based on the information that at least 2 African American families recently moved in without opposition. 40% are no longer all white, but that's still 60% that remains all white. That's 2/3. Once again, 17 years later, I'd like to think that that number has gone down at least a little bit. But as of 2006, 2/3 of the sundown towns were potentially still sundown towns. And I am focusing a lot on black people in this conversation, and that is because sundown towns were primarily targeted at black people. In fact, the signs explicitly use black slurs. Now, mind you, sundown towns also excluded Latino and Hispanics, Jewish people, Asian people. It's important to note that Chinese people had their own great retreat as well. White people excluded them from their towns, and the result is pretty much all of the Chinatowns in all of the major cities. So the reason why we have a Chinatown in Chicago is because white people were racist. So it's not that they only targeted black people, because they didn't. They did in fact target other groups of people. It's just the fact that over time, sundown towns that would exclude Hispanic and Latino people and Asian people slowly opened up to Hispanic, Latino, and Asian people. But sometimes even after they opened it up to Asian and, Hispanic and Latino people, they didn't open it up to black people. Black people continued to be excluded far beyond the towns opening up to other races. Even during the depths of the nadir, most sundown towns did not keep out Mexican Americans, except in the West. Most did not bar Asian Americans. As a result, nationally, Hispanics or Asians with third-grade educations are more likely to live among whites than is an African American with a PhD today. Historically, even sundown suburbs such as Cicero and Berwyn, Illinois, long notorious for their hostility to African Americans, allowed Mexican Americans as residents. By the 2000 census, Cicero's 85,616 population was almost 80% Hispanic, and Berwyn's was almost 40% and rising. I'm about to read a bit of a harrowing, very racist quote from a realtor back in 1994. Trigger warning. A realtor in Berry County, a sundown county in the Missouri Ozarks, leaned in this direction in remarks made in 1994. Blacks are so different that I just can't stand them. I can't help it. I hate them. My Doberman Pinscher lady used to terrorize blacks. I really enjoyed that. I can tolerate Mexicans. I even have some Mexicans working for me, but I just can't tolerate blacks. Do you understand why I focused on black people? White people opened up to other races, but it was literally just black people they continued to be assholes to. Although I will say that some of the most racist white people, once their protected little sundown town became mostly Mexican, they started fleeing. I know Cicero, Illinois has like a terrible sundown town history. Like, if you look that shit up, it's bad. But as soon as, the population began being mostly Hispanic and Latino, a bunch of the most racist white people in Cicero just kind of fled. it's not like there isn't prejudice against other races. It's that particularly black people, white people want to exclude. So, I mean, at this point, having some population of Hispanic or Latino or Asian people in your town does not necessarily exonerate it as a sundown town to me. Because, like, if you have, like, a 10% Hispanic rate, but, like, there are no black people there, that's not going to help you. I don't think that that means much, if I'm being honest. What I've learned today is that we should set aside that northern brain rot of north good, south bad, maybe do some actual research on racism in the United States, and don't make the North out to be this non-racist hero when they were very fucking racist. We still are. Northerners are still racist. We're not going to pretend like they aren't. I learned I am more concerned about my sister's boyfriend just driving in Illinois than I am him going to Colorado at this point. So anyways, if you want a lot more in-depth information, you can read Sundown Towns by James Lowen. It's a good book.